I actually go back to being students together at Bates College years ago. And back then, I knew Mark because of his activities on campus and off campus, and particularly off campus, where he was very involved with different food-oriented programs. At this early point, it was like a breakfast program, a counseling program, food co-op. And it was also at a moment of the United States when college students weren't so much leaving with their degrees and going into big corporations, but taking more active roles in communities. And that was really how I think of Mark too, within that sort of trajectory in life. From Maine, he went to Massachusetts and worked a couple of years, and then from 1979 to 2003, he was located in Hartford, Connecticut as the executive director of the Hartford food system. And in that position over those more than 20 years, he was involved in a really wide range of activities, including farmers market, food bank, community-supported agricultural farm, nutrition programs, and neighborhood supermarket, to name just a few of them. He left Hartford and the food system program in 2003 and was, for 2 years, 2002 to 2004, Food and Security Policy Fellow sponsored by the Kellogg Foundation. And in the years since, he's been writing, speaking, and consulting on food issues and food security issues, as well as working with groups which he has helped co-found, such as the Community Food Security Coalition. He's the author of the book Closing the Food Gap, which is for sale out there, and is working on another book on food security. And he will be speaking tonight about closing the food gap. And I welcome Mark Lee.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marlborough College and the community of Marlborough and Vermont for bringing me here. It's a great honor and privilege to share a few thoughts with you this evening. I also wanted to introduce my wife, Pam Roy. She's raising her hand. Yes. Say hello. She's been gracious enough to travel with me, keep me out of trouble. And she is also, you might want to spend some time talking to her. She runs a wonderful food program in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we live now, a program called Farm to Table. She's been very active in the local food movement herself for many years. So, Carol mentioned that I think I was more active off campus than on campus, and that's true because I was not terribly distinguished on campus. I graduated in that 10% of the class that made the top 90% possible. So I found that I could do much better in the community, trying to organize what was really a very low-income community of Lewiston, Maine, working class place that was beginning to kind of drift downward. Textile mills that were the traditional employers were going out of business. Shoe shops were also beginning to going into decline as well. So it was a rough and ready place. But it was a great laboratory for me because that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in communities and see what I could do to try to make a difference. And food was a great place to do it. I found that food was this opportunity that where, first of all, you didn't have to know a thing about food. You could just go off and do it. It's kind of a dare to be dumb kind of situation. One of my favorite quotes is by Mark Twain, who said that all you need in this life is ignorance and confidence. Success is sure to follow. And that's kind of how I've worked my life and my profession all along. And Lewiston gave me that opportunity to really get my hands dirty, learn directly from people who were in a real hurting state, in a community that was struggling. And I found that food was a way, in many cases, to help individuals, and it was also a way to help communities. And I'm gonna see if this works or not. I'm gonna read a little story for you. Start off. check out, I was talking to a couple of farmers earlier. How many farmers are here? Okay, that's not bad. How many students? Some students. How about faculty and other college staff? Good, all right. And other sort of general community activists, food activists, advocates, however you want to. I was chatting with some folks over here doing some good work in Brattleboro. Well, this is kind of, and how about gardeners? Other, just everyday gardeners. Okay, well, this is how I got started in gardening. Pay attention. Being the hardy and self-reliant people we think we are, Americans harbor a belief that when all else fails, we can always return to the land for our sustenance. When the oil runs out, the trucks and trains stop running, and the far-flung global food network crumbles into dust, our instinctive ability to coax food from the earth will save us. Such were my assumptions in the 1970s when I eagerly set out on my first job right out of college to organize a band of unruly Massachusetts teenagers around a new community farm. The young people had been sent to me by school disciplinarians, juvenile police officers, and local priests. The only thing we had in common was that none of us had ever gardened before. But like so many innocents before me, I assumed that planting and harvesting 2 acres of land would be a lark. I was further motivated by the town fathers who hired me. They told me in no uncertain terms that I had better do something productive with these, as they put it, damn kids, or I'd be out of a job, which is why it is still a mystery to me that I chose a project about which I knew nothing. Together, we took turns that first year at the farm, reading aloud from a plant science textbook, while the rest of us, on our knees in the dirt, tried to follow the instructions. We managed to plant a reasonable semblance of a garden, and knowing nothing, however, about the correct use of agricultural chemicals, our farm became organic by default. Coincidentally, this made our produce highly coveted by Boston's small but growing organic market. By some miracle, we had managed to cultivate a righteous patch of organic cantaloupes for which a natural food store was willing to pay top dollar, if only we could deliver them ripe and ready to eat. Our textbook, however, did not tell us how to determine when cantaloupes are ripe. Each day we waited in a heightened state of anticipation, trying every trick we'd heard of to assess their maturity. After one particularly long day of thumping, sniffing, and squeezing melons, I lay my weary head down on my pillow, only to be awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by my frantic wife. She was yelling, "Stop it! Stop it!" Groggily, I asked her what was wrong. She said, "You're squeezing my ass and yelling. Are the melons right?" It's a true story. Not married anymore, however. So I imagine that all of you as gardeners or farmers have had that kind of anxiety experience. I certainly did. But I also found that gardening was a great way to get involved in working with young people. And that was my first job, working with young folks. Again, even though I knew nothing. And I've been so, you have to kind of, you have to kind of go with my nostalgia here occasionally, that I look back over the course of 35 years, and I'm so excited to see the growth in the food movement around this country. When we started out in the 70s, there were no farmers markets, hardly. There were very few community gardens. Gardening was still something that your grandmother did. This whole concept of a local food movement was, well, there was no such idea. I mean, what was the word of the year in 2008? Anybody know? Locavore. Locavore. Does anybody know there is a word of the year? I mean, there's actually something called a word of the year. Well, the word of the year in 2008 was locavore, meaning eating locally. That just shows you how far we've come. So that's exciting. It's exciting for somebody like myself who's been involved in this work for so long that I no longer have to explain exactly what I do. In fact, my mother actually understands what I do now. It's taken her about 40 years, and now she doesn't ask me anymore. She actually sends me news clippings out of her local newspaper, stories about local farmers, local food, local gardens, whatever. She keeps sending me these clippings. So she gets it, so I think everybody must get it. But what I found in the course of my work, and where I started out more seriously after working in Massachusetts for a few years, in Hartford, Connecticut, I was really fortunate to get a position in a newly formed nonprofit organization called the Hartford Food System. And the Hartford Food System was set up, like its name suggests, to address the whole food system. And this was a new concept. We weren't thinking about this sort of seed-to-table approach, connecting lots of dots in the food system. That hadn't really been conceived of yet. So I was very lucky to get this position. And however, I discovered that Hartford was one of the poorest cities in the country. People may not know that, but as of, at least of today, Hartford is the second poorest city in the country. 31% of the population lives below the poverty level. Connecticut as a whole has 3 cities, Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport, which are among the poorest in the country. The irony, of course, is that the state of Connecticut is either the first or the second wealthiest based on per capita income. So we had these islands of poverty surrounded by these great sort of, oceans or seas of wealth, but the twain would never meet. My job was to work in a low-income community and see what we could do with respect to food to make a difference in people's lives. And it was there that I began to see what I have come to call and title my book, The Food Gap, The Food Gaps. And all my work was about trying to close those food gaps. So I'm going to spend a little time just discussing what those gaps are. I did want to say at the beginning, however, that I'd like to save a little time for some conversation with you to hear about what you're doing locally, what you're thinking as well. So I want to make sure I reserve some time for that. But I basically come up with 3 gaps. One is sort of generally I call poverty, hunger, and food insecurity. The second is obesity, overweight, and diet-related illnesses. And the third we call limited access to healthy and affordable food, meaning food deserts, communities that are underserved by sources of good, healthy food. But in the hunger and poverty category, about 12% of the U.S. population is considered hungry or food insecure. I don't know if people follow those numbers, but starting about 12 or 13 years ago, the U.S. Department of Agriculture actually started asking a series of questions during the annual census, or annual survey census, that were designed to find out how many people exactly are having difficulty getting enough food on a regular basis, not having enough money to be able to buy food, doing things like skipping meals so that their children could eat, or in some cases sending their children out to play at 5 o'clock in the afternoon with the neighbor's children in the hopes that the neighbor's parents would feed their children. These are a lot of coping behaviors that, in a country where we don't really have starvation, we have this tremendous sort of insecurity or anxiety, or because where our next meal is coming from is not always known. Sort of an unpredictability situation, if you will. Now, that number, 12%, which is about 36 million Americans, is going to go up because of the recession. This census, or the results of this census, are announced every year. Just about this time, you'll probably see some reports out in the next couple of weeks when USDA announces the next set of numbers. I've always been interested in, I was actually involved a little bit in the design of the survey itself, the development of questions. So I've always followed this closely, and I've always been interested in it. And a couple of years ago, the U.S. Department of Agriculture eliminated this category they called hunger. They didn't call it hunger anymore. They called it very low food security. which I think is probably okay. I have some objections, but you know, we've created these, and the number who are hungry or have very low food security is considerably less, about 3 to 5% of the population. But in that category, I found, you kind of dig deeper into the report, I found there were 691,000 children in the United States that are hungry, very low food security. Now that's not a big number, or certainly not a big percentage of the population. It's about 0.2%. But nevertheless, almost 700,000 children considered hungry. And I looked at another figure just because I like bizarre comparisons, perhaps. And I found that Americans buy about 700,000 widescreen TVs every month of 40 inches or more. That's about 8 million widescreen TVs of over 40 inches each year, and at about $1,000 each. And my son tells me their price is coming down and I should actually buy one. It's about $8 billion. $8 billion on 40-inch or more TVs. Now, if somebody happens to have one, or I know Carol probably has 3 or 4. You know, I'm not criticizing you, but I sort of think, that would be a lot of money that we could use to make a big difference in that 691,000 hungry children in this country. You completely would wipe out hunger and food insecurity. You'd be able to send those kids to really good schools. And you probably would be able to provide health insurance, really good health insurance, in fact, to all those children. So you can choose whatever comparison you want, whatever symbol of American wealth or materialism you want. But I do think that it points out the real disparity that we have in the United States between the rich and the poor. Maybe even more importantly, what our priorities are. And it was this idea of priorities and how we kind of addressed hunger and its cause, poverty, that really got my interest. And I started to probe more and think about food programs in the United States, food assistance programs. We have 15 food assistance programs in the United States. These are all operated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Does anyone know, can anyone name a couple?
Food stamps.
Food stamps, which is now called SNAP. Yes. Others? WIC, Women, Infant, and Children Program. Others?
Federal lunch program.
School lunch and school breakfast. So these are all child nutrition programs. There are senior feeding programs. We have a few called the Farmers Market Nutrition Program, which provides coupons to WIC and senior citizens to buy food at farmers markets. And there are others. I can't even keep track of all of them myself. Together, the funding for these represents about $85 billion now. It keeps going up pretty rapidly. The food stamp program is by far the largest. It's an entitlement program, which means that Congress doesn't have to fund it every year. It simply goes up with demand. Now, in one sense, these are great programs. You know, they keep people from really going hungry in the United States. They are called a safety net. Yet I was kind of wondering, why do we have so many food programs? And compared to other countries like Europe and Canada, Japan, developed nations, they don't have all these food programs. Well, it's because they have general welfare programs that provide basic needs for everybody, more or less. They don't focus just on food. Now, why is it that we focus so much on food as such an intricate and integral part of our social welfare system in the United States? Well, my theory, and it's not backed up with enormous research, but I think that generally people agree with me, that we as a country are highly committed to eliminating poverty. We don't want to see somebody go hungry. We don't want someone to starve to death. We are very compassionate people at heart. But we're also a people with a very strong set of values and attitudes toward poverty. That we believe that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They should take care of their own, they should help themselves, in other words. I came across a survey, it's called the World Values Survey. And it compared American attitudes toward poverty to those in the countries in the European Union. And they asked a couple of questions I thought were telling. One was, do you feel that people are trapped in poverty? The poor are trapped in poverty. In the United States, about 25% of the people said, yeah, I think people are actually trapped in poverty. In Europe, they said about 60% of the people agreed they were trapped in poverty. Then they asked the question, do you think the poor are lazy? And in the United States, kind of guess what happened. About 60% of the respondents said, yeah, the poor are lazy. And in Europe, about 25% said the poor are lazy. Now, to me, that kind of goes to the heart of the problem, that we as a nation aren't going to make the kind of commitment to ending poverty that we need to in order to end hunger and food insecurity. Again, we won't let somebody go hungry, but we aren't going to do what we can to help them get out of poverty. So I began to feel that the role of food programs was simply there to manage poverty. It wasn't there to end it. And yet I found myself caught up in this whole effort to try to build up those programs, bring in more money, and so forth. And then in the early 1980s, during my work in Hartford, I got involved in developing a food bank. This became later one of the largest food banks in New England. And this was at a time of real crisis in the United States, not unlike the crisis we have now, when high unemployment, general economic downturn, but probably more importantly, Ronald Reagan had come into office, and because of their conservative political philosophy, had cut a lot of social welfare programs. Social welfare programs that had brought down the poverty level significantly during the 1970s. And as a result of both this conservative philosophy and the economic downturn, we started to see people lining up like we'd never seen them before. We only had 5 or 6 soup kitchens at that time in the city, and a couple of homeless shelters. We had one mission agency that had been around since the 1880s. So, we had just these very small programs that just helped people out in real emergency situations. They were overwhelmed. We had to start food banks. We didn't have food banks then. People may not know that in the early 1980s there were no food banks. Today there are 205 across the United States. There are 60,000 places where you can, food pantries, soup kitchens, where you can get emergency food. Today in Hartford, whereas there were 6 in the early 1980s, there are now 400 food pantries. We've seen this incredible growth in private charity as a response to hunger. And I frankly have grown disillusioned with that. Even though I was very much involved in developing some of those food banks, I don't regard it as a legacy that I'm particularly proud of. I sometimes think of these a couple of lines by T.S. Eliot, speaking of his own generation. They were a decent, godless people. Their only legacy, miles of pavement and 1,000 lost golf balls. I sometimes think our legacy may only be millions of square feet of food bank warehouses and tens of thousands of food pantries. I hope not. I hope that's not our legacy. I hope that we have something more profound to offer in terms of solutions and not band-aids. So this is a combination of a food gap, food insecurity, hunger, and a response to that, but not, in my mind, an adequate response, namely looking at food assistance programs, and together, if you put the private charity together with the public assistance, you're looking at something close to $100 billion a year. that are now being spent in the United States, primarily to manage poverty, not to end it. Getting down to what I think are some of the more basic elements or failures in the U.S. economy. It's perhaps no secret that we are kind of getting into even a lower wage economy constantly. It's not just recently with the recession, but this has been occurring fairly consistently over the past several years. I had a conversation, I was doing a story about food stamps in New Mexico. And I met with the director of a county food stamp office in a large county site in the center of the state. And he was perplexed by the fact that he was seeing this incredible increase in the number of food stamp applicants coming into his office. And he was perplexed because the unemployment rate in his county was about 2%, which is almost nothing. And he began to kind of look at the situation, and he realized that what was going on was by far the largest employers in his county were two very large Walmart stores. One was a big regional distribution center. And their wages were so low that the employees qualified for food stamps. So in effect, taxpayers were subsidizing America's largest retailer by providing food stamps to its employees. And I'm beginning to think that this direction that we need to be taking, if we really are genuinely interested in eradicating hunger and food insecurity in this country, is to bring about a living wage, not just a minimum wage, but a living wage where everybody is receiving probably at least $10 an hour, in some communities more like $12 to $15 an hour. I always, even though I have some problems with this gentleman, Henry Ford was always known as a person who would pay his employees enough so they could afford the cars that they were producing, that they were manufacturing. Why shouldn't we be paying people enough so they can buy the food they need in this country? So I think that this is really at the heart of our problem. Now, of course, let's look at another food gap. Overweight, obesity, diet-related illnesses. You're all, I'm sure, hearing lots about obesity and what its impact is in America. You've heard about how our diet has changed radically over the last 20 to 30 years. Many of you have probably read Michael Pollan and have learned about the impact of high fructose corn syrup and overconsumption of calories and cheap calories, and how that's often fueled by bad public policies or bad farm policies in this country that subsidize corn but don't subsidize broccoli. So you're sure you're aware of that, but over 60% of us now are obese or overweight. It's costing us as a nation $147 billion a year of additional healthcare costs as a result directly of obesity. There have been some studies recently that said that unless we're able to get the obesity problem under control in this country, we're never going to get healthcare costs under control. The largest category of pharmaceuticals that are purchased by the American public are metabolic drugs that are used to treat diabetes, high cholesterol, and so forth. We're spending a lot of money to try to help us control our weight or to fix the problems that are caused by a bad diet. To me, the most frightening statement was made by the Center for Disease Control, a U.S. agency, that said that this could be the first generation of children in this country to not live as long as their parents' generation, due in fact to obesity. Have people heard that before? Heard that statement? And I have found in the course of my work in Hartford that these problems are all much more serious in low-income communities than they are in sort of higher-income communities. There's certainly a relationship between education, making good food choices, and whether or not you have healthy weight or your weight's too high. I had this one incident kind of illustrated the problem for me when I was in Hartford. We had gone into the school superintendent's office in the city of Hartford. We asked the school superintendent if he'd be willing to remove all of the soda machines from the schools, from the public schools in the city, about 30 or more schools. This was like one of the poorest school districts in the state. The rates of obesity, diabetes were 2 to 3 times greater than they were for the state as a whole. And he said no. And the reason he said no was because he felt that by having soda machines, it gave students a choice. It gave them an actual choice that they could make because they could decide to either not buy that Coke or to buy it. I never quite understood his logic, but that was the way he was thinking. So we looked at the curriculum of the schools, and we found that in total, a child would get about 4 hours of health education every year in the Hartford schools, 4 hours. Now out of that, about 1 hour was dedicated to nutrition education. About 3 hours was dedicated to sex, drugs, hygiene, keeping your socks clean, whatever. And food was 1 hour. Now, how much information are you going to get from that kind of education in which to make that choice about whether or not to buy that soda? When in fact, an average child is watching 3 to 4 hours of television per day. The content of which, advertising content, is very heavily weighted in favor of fast food places, McDonald's, and so forth. So again, obesity, overweight, the fact that schools were not stepping up and providing good nutrition education or food education, that we were not only were we generating a generation of children that are overweight and sick, they simply don't have the skills that they need, cognitive or manual, in order to be able to make good choices, to grow a garden perhaps, or to prepare healthy meals. But the other related feature of this is the last food gap, which is I call limited access to healthy and affordable food, but we also kind of give it a quick name we call food deserts. Have people heard the term food deserts before? You've heard food deserts. Food deserts refer to communities that simply don't have a decent grocery store, a good place where you can get a good full range of food, including fruits and vegetables, and that food's available at affordable prices. Urban areas, particularly low-income urban areas, are notorious as food deserts, as are many rural communities in the United States. The American Rural Sociological Society actually counted up 800 rural counties that they consider food deserts. But I found this to be particularly profound and obvious in Hartford and other cities where supermarkets simply began to abandon the city. They just walked away, starting in the 1960s through the 1970s. There were 13 supermarkets in the city of Hartford in the 1960s. Today, there is one, and that's located on the edge of town, much closer to the suburbs than it is to the center city. Typical food desert looks like the 8th Ward in Washington, D.C. The 8th Ward is only about a mile from the nation's capital building. It has 70,000 residents. 38% of them are poor. 38% of them are obese. And until a year ago, you couldn't find a supermarket in the 8th Ward. You couldn't find a place where you could buy fresh fruits and vegetables. You could find every manner of junk food, of fast food, of convenience food stores. You know, there was McBurger and Taco Hut and Colonel Coronary, but there was no place to get fresh, healthy food. Now, fortunately, the District of Columbia and some advocates stepped up and worked with the supermarket industry, and they were able to bring a supermarket into the 8th Ward about a year ago, which is the kind of solution we're beginning to see. We're beginning to see both the public and private sector taking responsibility for this facet of the food gap. Yet I remain a bit skeptical, because I was one who saw these supermarket chains simply, I mean, they would pull out in the middle of the night because they knew how harmful it was to the community, and they knew what the reaction would be like. They would slap up plywood on their windows, they'd lock up the doors, they'd put iron gates across the front, and that was it. They walked away. And at the same time that they're closing these stores in the city, they're building brand new, shiny, huge stores, state-of-the-art stores in the suburbs. They're building it often on farmland and taking over that farmland. It's now becoming sprawl, and their stores are part of fine, shiny new shopping centers. So that was the direction, and I found that very discouraging, and it made me, in fact, rather angry. But now we're beginning to turn that ship around at least a little bit. One of the model programs in that regard is something called the Fresh Food Financing Initiative in the state of Pennsylvania, which was started because of a really good nonprofit organization called the Food Trust came up and did some research on food deserts in Philadelphia and showed that people were literally dying because they didn't have access to good, healthy food. And the state of Pennsylvania put up $30 million of funding, public funding, to develop new food stores in food deserts, underserved communities all over the state. That's been matched by $90 million of private funding. And just in 4 years of the life of that program, they've developed over 40 new supermarkets in both rural and urban areas. And they've also developed, which includes about 1.5 million square feet of new retail space and 3,700 new jobs, I believe, along with all those food stores. So it's been that combination of public investment and with private operators that have begun to restore these communities. Now, one thing I find interesting about that is none of those new stores are from chain supermarkets or chain corporate operations. They're all coming from sort of local independent supermarket operators. And I just find that interesting that American corporations have not yet stood up and said, okay, we're going to try to redress this imbalance. We're going to, we don't have to say we're sorry, but we can at least go in and try to make amends. They don't seem to be doing that yet. So what this all kind of comes down to for me is three things in terms of how we try to address these food gaps. I got 3 food gaps. I got three P's. My 3 P's are projects, partnerships, and policies. Projects are the kind of thing that a lot of people are engaged in. I know in this room, some of you are working with farmers markets, or you've developed CSAs, or you have you're working with young people in gardening programs, even food pantries and food banks. These are all projects. By themselves, they're not enough. They're not enough to have the kind of impact we really need to close the food gap. So what many of us have been doing is forming partnerships, building coalitions, collaborations all across the communities, states, and the country. And that's the kind of thing we need to be doing, and we're doing it because it conserves resources, it coordinates our efforts, and we just get more bang for the buck, because there's a lot of stuff we can do together that we simply can't do alone. But this third P, policy, actually engaging government, finding solutions, and working in partnership with the private sector is not something we're doing a really good job with yet. Now, the example I gave you in Pennsylvania is a good example, and we're starting to see more of that. We've been working with groups around the country to form food policy councils, local and state level collaborations of food system stakeholders, everything from food banks to gardeners to farmers to the supermarket industry and beyond, and government agencies to bring together those resources to try to close the food gap, but using the levers of government, both local and state. Just to give you a couple of quick examples, we were able in Hartford, we documented the fact that people were using public buses to get to supermarkets in the suburbs. But the bus routes had not been designed particularly well to connect people who lived in the center city to the supermarkets. We pointed this out, we did a lot of research, we did a lot of advocacy, and as a result of that, we were able to create brand new routes, bus routes that took people directly to supermarkets. So instead of a 45-minute ride that required 2 changes of the bus, we are now able to have a direct 15-minute route, no change. In New Mexico, they've been actually been able to get a lot of the junk food out of the schools, including the soda machines, and start to bring in more local food in the schools. I know you're doing that in Vermont in a really big way, in a really good way. Let's try to find public policies that are going to benefit local farmers at the same time they're going to benefit hungry kids. There's many good examples of these kinds of local and state-based efforts that are beginning to bear fruit, and much of this comes from organizing these food policy councils. So many of you may be familiar with the Farm Bill. Are you familiar with the Farm Bill from 2007, 2008? This is the time when the U.S. government sets its policies for the next 5 years that have the most impact on our food supply, and our food system. How food is produced, the cost of food, quality of food, etc. And we had always been putting too much money into commodity crops like corn and soybeans and rice and cotton, and actually subsidizing very large growers of these items. These are the major, in many cases, major causes of our obesity crisis. We've put almost nothing into the subsidy of fruits and vegetables, or in efforts to promote local food systems. We made some real changes in this last Farm Bill. We actually were able to bring about some new funding streams that are helping farmers markets, helping communities develop new food projects, small farmers, new farmers, immigrant farmers, disadvantaged farmers. There's been a whole new slew of efforts to try to address this imbalance. It's another way that we can use policy to make a difference. We can promote good local healthy food systems, bring stores back into communities, and begin to make healthy food more prevalent. So it's these 3 Ps, projects, policy, partnerships, and policies that I keep recommending to people, that you got to do all 3. You can't just do one. And I also think that that looking at the way that we run our food assistance programs and our food banks, there's a couple of things that are not happening, a couple of things that are happening, and some things that are not happening with those. One is that I like a quote from Van Jones. Van Jones is a black American activist who has been kind of noteworthy for speaking out on green jobs and trying to bring green jobs into local communities. He's also the recently resigned White House advisor on the Green Jobs program. But Van Jones has said that we are servicing many communities into poverty because we are providing so many services, and we are not building the wealth or the capacity of those communities to help themselves. And that's where we need to be targeting our work. We need to actually be building the wealth of these communities and empowering individuals to help themselves, and not continue to only provide food benefits or food handouts, because that, in Van Jones' opinion, begins to service them into poverty. So I know it requires a real shift in our thinking, but I think it's something that we have to grapple with unless we just want to keep spending tens of billions of dollars every year on food assistance programs and not making a single dent in its cause, namely poverty. I'd like to, want to wrap up at this point. There's many, many things I could say, and I know you don't want to hear everything I have to say, but I want to give you just a couple of examples of some people that I've met. I've been really fortunate to meet over the last couple of years in my travels and my writing, to suggest, I think, some of what I mean, because as much as I favor projects and programs and policies and so forth, there's so much of this change, so much change is required that involves the individual at a very local and very personal level. And I don't always think that our program thinking and our policy thinking accounts for that very well. And so I want to share a couple of stories from some people I've met recently. When I imagine a different path that you could take away from our current system of helping people and developing communities, I like to think of Maurice Small, who's a middle-aged African-American who grew up in Cleveland's housing projects. Tired of seeing the same vacant lots as an adult that he saw as a kid, he's led the charge for what is now a burgeoning urban agriculture movement in a city that has lost 50% of its population in the last 10 years. With assistance from City Hall, the Cleveland Cuyahoga Food Policy Council, Oberlin College, Case Western University, and the Cleveland Clinic, Maurice has mobilized people and land to produce $2 million of food annually. As he put it himself, "I'm a kid from the projects who's now selling organic vegetables to white tablecloth restaurants." Maurice is an amazing guy. If you ever go to Cleveland and want to be inspired, try to spend 10 minutes. Try to keep up with him for 10 minutes. You'll be exhausted. I was after a day. But a lot of things happened here. He's a person with a lot of initiative who saw these problems, but he's also getting a lot of help at the same time. In this case, in Cleveland, they made changes in their zoning laws that allowed community gardens to flourish. There was a lot of pressure on the land and on the people when a garden was established. The zoning laws were changed to protect them. They're now dedicating a percentage of their purchasing that they use for food purchasing in the county and in the city for institutions, public institutions. Much of that is now being committed to buying locally, buying from urban gardeners and urban farmers, as well as farmers in just like a 20-mile radius around the city of Cleveland. They also passed an ordinance recently that allows raising hens and bees in their backyards in the city. This is something that's been happening all across the country. It's been a lot of fun and interesting to watch. But if you're in Cleveland now, you're now allowed, officially, and it's legal, you don't have to hide anymore, 4 hens and 1 beehive per city lot. So that's the kind of creative policy thinking that's taking place and helping people like Maurice flourish. But I also think of Dorothy Washington, who lives currently in an Austin, Texas housing project. A 35-year-old African-American who's overweight and has 5 children. Dorothy could easily be mistaken for the archetypal welfare mom. But instead of accepting cans from a food pantry, she got involved with a program called the Happy Kitchen that is run by the nonprofit Sustainable Food Center. Through the peer-led food education program, she learned how to use herbs to flavor her food instead of fat, and how to interest her children in vegetables. Dorothy and her children have lost weight. She has more confidence in herself and is making a greater commitment to serving her community. As a quiet woman of faith, she notes Riley about her new diet. God didn't make nachos. It's a great program in Austin. I saw hundreds of people going through a pretty intensive course, completely changing the way they eat, doing things like learning how to simply read a nutrition label, which is actually pretty important. And I discovered to my chagrin that I wasn't doing it correctly. How to buy healthy whole foods cheaply, how to prepare good meals. And the thing that was remarkable about this, and most of the people I met there were women, is that the confidence they were developing over the course of this program, participating in this program, they really felt good about themselves. They really felt good about what they were doing for their family. It was just changing they began to sit up straight. They became more articulate. They became more confident. They kind of looked you in the eye. And I thought that was really interesting, that by simply learning how to cook well and healthfully, that you could actually change your whole frame of mind at the same time. Many of them were becoming leaders in the community. Some of them were going to schools and trying to get the schools to change the food they were serving. Some of them were becoming teachers themselves or peer leaders. Others were becoming organizers. Food is a good place to start with the individual, a good way to bring about individual change that can then have profound change impacts throughout the community. And then I also think about Cindy Torres, second-generation Mexican-American who grew up in South Texas. She co-founded the Boulder, Colorado County Food Policy Council to empower that community to make sustainably produced available to all. Under her leadership, the council recently opposed a proposal to take over thousands of acres of publicly owned farmland for genetically modified sugar beets. The Monsanto Corporation had forced local farmers into a box because GMO sugar beet seed now dominates 95% of the market. Cynthia and her community found their voice, the voice of democracy, and defeated that proposal. But just as importantly, they are now working with the same farmers and the county to come up with a plan to use this public land for diversified and sustainable food production that will benefit the entire community. So these are the kinds of stories and the kinds of people and the kind of programs and the kinds of policies that are beginning to make a difference at the local level. Speaking to a couple of farmers earlier, who told me how I guess inspired you were by the fact that so many people in the community were coming to you. They wanted to buy your food. They thought they want a local farmer. You know, they want to participate in the system. This is a great movement and a great moment, and I've been riding it and enjoying it immensely. I mean, food is the center of my life, and it's the center of my health. It's the center of my environment, and I even make money from it. But I think it's also that piece. It's that opportunity. It's that gap that still has to be closed. And I think it's one that we all still have to take responsibility for. You know, it's not enough just to be a good food consumer. I think we need to be good food citizens as well. We need to be able to take responsibility for the decisions that are made at our community level or in our state legislature about our food and our farm and our health. And it's that responsibility that we also have to share for those who aren't yet participating in this great, wonderful, sustainable and local food movement. So with those thoughts, I thank you very much for your attention and your questions. So I know you all know more about Vermont than I do. So I'd love to hear what you think. Does this make sense for Vermont, for your communities, or just whatever, or questions?
Well, actually, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is very strong in all these areas. And of course, right down the road is Joel Salatin, one of the heroes of Food Incorporated, Poly-based farm. And also, the Shenandoah Valley has a lot of Mennonites and Amish and those sort of things. Lots of farmers markets. But the University of Virginia did an interesting study, and you've alluded to this a great deal tonight, but, and they found that there's a whole group of people in that area who, you know, well one group is, you know, buying from Poly-based farm. My daughter-in-law gets all her meat. The Chimbote chain now in Charlottesville gets all fresh pork from Joel Salatin. But there's a whole group of people that aren't part of the system at all because, of course, they don't have the money. They can't buy all their meat from Poly-based farm, or they can't go to Whole Foods. You have to buy really cheap produce. And I thought that was just, you know, it's a problem because, you know, there's sort of the food elite, people who, as you say, are fairly sophisticated and well-educated, and they know what to buy, and they can afford to buy it. There's a huge group of people that aren't.
That's right. And I think that, again, it is beginning to work on one end of that, which is people's buying power. I don't think we can ask farmers to give up, lower their prices in order to make sure that that food is available to them, because I know that many of those farmers are living on a this question came up the other night when I was talking, and someone was suggesting, well, I mean, this is why we have factory farms, because we want to have cheap food. Okay, well, we shouldn't have factory farms for a lot of reasons. And we shouldn't have them because we're trying to produce cheap food for one class of people, while we have Joel Salatin producing food for another class of people. Now, this to me is a fundamental inequity, and it is social injustice, and it's what we have to try to figure out how to cope with. Now, I think that, in addition to trying to raise people's wages so they can participate fully in this food system, I think there's other ways as well. I found that education has been effective. People can shop at a farmer's market on a limited budget. They can buy, they can buy very healthy, very good food, but they need some help. They need to be able to get more information and some training and some confidence in order to do that. I've been very excited by the Farmers Market Nutrition Program, which provides benefits directly to low-income families to shop at farmers markets, and in some cases CSAs. The food stamp program is now, we're seeing more of the EBT technology, because it's a swipe card system, now being used at farmers markets. That's making it easier for food stamp recipients to go to farmers markets. So we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of ideas, a lot of sort of incentives. There is a lot of discussion in the last Farm Bill about trying to incentivize the food stamp program so that you would, if you would get more food if you were using your food stamps to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. You'd sort of get more value out of the food stamp. There's some resistance to that, and that's another story why there's resistance, but well, the story has something to do with our whole idea that we should only be focusing on food and not on poverty. But holding that aside, people are looking for creative ways to use the value that's there, the existing benefits, and try to redirect it toward better food. So it's still, but the food gap is still huge, and I'm worried that unless we are paying attention, it's going to just get bigger. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Why do the large grocery stores leave the city?
There's a lot of reasons. Part of it is that in the 1960s there were race riots in urban America, and that scared the bejesus out of a lot of people, particularly supermarkets, because they were often the ones that got hit during the riots. The middle class started to leave urban America at the same time. They were moving to the suburbs. So the supermarket said, well, we're not going to stay behind and only serve poor people of color. We're going to go to the suburbs where we can serve more white and more affluent shoppers. So it was a rational business decision in one sense, but it nevertheless abandoned a very large percentage of the population that needed to have those affordable stores available more than anybody else. But that's basically what happened. And there's another part of the story, which is that supermarkets began to change in terms of their format. They wanted to get bigger. They were very oriented toward cars. They needed like 4 acres of parking lot. There was a requirement around the supermarket. We're going to put up a 60 or 70,000 square foot store. We need 4 acres of parking lot to go with that one store. That store had to be near large thoroughfares or interstates in order to be accessible. So we became much more car-oriented in our shopping. It was very hard to assemble that much land or even think about parking lots in cities. So the whole kind of urban piece of supermarket thinking just fell off the map for a variety of reasons. Yes?
I really appreciate your 3 Ps, and especially your observation that the policy component has really been lacking in this movement. And I guess what I observe in this community and other work that I've been doing is that it seems people are very interested in this topic and they want to get involved in the projects and the partnerships. People seem very eager to do things at the community level. And I think a lot of that almost comes from a defeatist attitude that they turn to the grassroots as opposed to really putting the efforts into the big policies. And so I agree with you that the policy piece needs to be strengthened, and I'm curious, what are your strategies to really strengthen that? component of this. Change that, I think.
Well, I mean, one are these food policy councils. I think those are the organizing people at a local or state level. We can focus on the policies that we can affect at city hall or county legislature. I think that's one way to do it. I think there needs to be a lot of education around policy. I use the term getting our heads above the plate, which means that most of us just kind of eat because we like the food. You know, we're not thinking about where it's coming from. We're not thinking about all the political content of that food. And we need to educate people so they understand, well, I want more local food. Why am I not getting more local food? Well, our policies are screwed up. That's part of the reason. Farmers are having a hard time for a variety of reasons. So it's an education process that you have to kind of, done a lot of op-ed writing, letters to the editor, blogging, and all the other stuff that I don't even understand. And a good, strong mass media campaign is one way to sort of help people understand that what's in front of them on the plate has a lot to do with decisions that are made by policymakers. I haven't seen a lot of good examples yet, but I'm looking for them. Is what is it that could we train and cultivate a community of sort of indigenous leaders, people who live in a community, low-income people of color, who are adversely impacted by our food system, to become bolder and speak out and begin to organize and take on these issues. I've seen a few good examples. One is in West Oakland, California, the Bay Area, a group called the People's Grocery, led by a wonderful guy named Brahma Mahdi, that are really training people to speak up for themselves and to try to get control over their food system and actually have a share of ownership in the development of new food enterprises in that community. So, there are some models, but they're still in kind of an early stage. I could go into some others later, yeah.
I'm interested in the way that this applies